Good evening. I'm Xavier Salomon, the Peter J. Sharp Chief Curator at the Frick Collection in New York. And welcome to this episode of Travels with a Curator. This evening, we follow in the footsteps of this aristocratic man from Spain who was portrayed in the 1790s by Goya. And this is the wonderful portrait we have at the Frick Collection, which was acquired in 1943 by the museum with a group of paintings and a sculpture which had belonged to the collector J.P. Morgan and were then inherited by his son Jack and acquired by the Frick Collection in 1943 as a group of works. This is the portrait of a man called Pedro De Alcntara, Téllez-Girón, who was the 9th Duke of Osuna. And he was a member of a family who was particularly close to Goya as patrons, and both him and his wife and their children were all portrayed by Goya a number of times. He was born in 1755, and he was actually the second child of the 8th Duke of Osuna, but his older brother died, and he inherited the title in 1787 when his father died. Before that, in 1772, he had married Maria Josefa Pimentel, who was the 12th Countess and Duchess of Benavente, an aristocrat in her own title. And the couple became one of the most important couples of the aristocracy in Spain at that time in the second half of the 18th and well into the 19th century. Here is another portrait of the Duke of Osuna by Guillermo Duchess from 1805. This is a painting which is now at the Prado, and it shows the sitter in a portrait at the Frick. The Duke of Osuna was very interested in art, in culture, in literature. Together with his wife, they were one of the most enlightened couples in Madrid at the time. He also was a military figure and a diplomatic figure. He was sent as an ambassador to Vienna in the early 19th century, and even though he never actually made it to Vienna, he stopped in Paris, where he became very ill and then returned to Madrid, where he died in 1807. The portrait we have at the Frick shows the Duke in civil outfit. He doesn't wear any orders, any aristocratic symbols, but he holds a letter in his hand which identifies him as Il Duque de Osuna por Goya. So it's a letter which identifies both sitter and painter. The wife of the Duke of Osuna, the Duchess, who, as I've said, was also Countess Duchess of Benavente in her own right, was also a very important figure at the time. She introduced French fashion in Spain. She was very fond of wearing hats and dresses in the style of Marie Antoinette of France. This, of course, is the period just before and of the French Revolution. And by the time the Osunas get to Paris in the early 1800s, we are at the beginning, of course, of the Napoleonic period. So they're living in a very turbulent time for Europe, for France, for Spain. And the Duchess was considered a very enlightened figure. She was a patron of the arts in her own right. She was a fashion setter and someone who was very beloved in the cultural circles of Madrid and Spain. And this is a portrait of the Duchess, also by Goya. The most famous portrait produced for the family is a family portrait, in fact, and it shows the 9th Duke and the Duchess surrounded by 2 daughters and 2 sons, and this is now at the Prado in Madrid. What is fascinating about this is that they're shown as a modern family. This sort of portrait for the late 18th, early 19th century would have been very strange and very unusual. Usually there were much more formal portraits of aristocrats, men and women, usually in separate portraits, and very rarely shown in this very informal setting. The Duchess is seated, the Duke behind her, and the children playing with their toys around them. The eldest boy to the left riding in a sort of wonderful detail, riding his father's cane almost as a hobby horse, which of course implies the idea that the boy will grow up to be, as he did, the 10th Duke of Osuna. The family followed modern principles, the principles of Rousseau and of French philosophy, in educating their children in a modern and enlightened way, which of course for Spain at that time was incredibly unusual. This is an image of an exhibition that took place a few years ago at the National Gallery in London on Goya's portraits, and we lent the portrait of the Duke of Osuna, and this was the one time when the portrait of the Duke, the portrait of the Duchess, which is in a private collection, and the Goya family portrait in the Prado were all shown together, and it was wonderful to be able to see them all on one wall. The Osunas lived in Madrid, but also had a residence outside of the city, the so-called Capricho, or the Alameda de Osuna, which is now very close to the airport of Madrid. And it is a beautiful park with this residence in the middle of it. And this is where the Duke and Duchess had most of their art collection, including a series of very beautiful paintings, these are just two of them, of witchcraft scenes by Goya, which the Duchess particularly was very interested in. As an enlightened intellectual, she was very skeptical, of course, of all these superstitious beliefs about witches and Sabbaths and so on. And so she commissioned these from Goya in a way to kind of sort of meditate on the beliefs of people and the sort of things that she as an enlightened woman didn't necessarily believe in. But these are wonderful small paintings by Goya, and you have to imagine that all of them would have originally been in that residence in the Alameda de Osuna. But this evening we travel to the south of Spain in the footsteps of the Osunas, and we actually traveled to the town of Osuna, which is very close to Sevilla in Andalusia in the south of Spain. And this is an old town surrounded by beautiful countryside, which was the main title land of the Osunas. They were lords of this area of Andalusia. And even though they did travel occasionally to Osuna and they had a residence there, the family mostly lived in Madrid. But Osuna is worth visiting because it is a city filled with wonderful buildings, churches and secular buildings. This, for example, is the University of Osuna, which was created in the 16th century and functioned well into the 19th century. And again, it is an active study center today. But this was created by an ancestor of the Duke of Osuna who created this university in the 16th century there. And this is the wonderful cloister, central courtyard of that university. Osuna is famous today, amongst many different reasons, as the set of the TV series Game of Thrones, which was filmed in Osuna in a number of different locations. But that is not the reason why we traveled there today, but we do so to look at the great treasures, works of art that are kept in the small, exquisite little town, and also, as I said, on the footsteps of the Duke and Duchess. This is the main church of Osuna, which is up high in the town, overlooking the rest of the valley and the town. This is the Colegiata, the collegiate church of Nuestra Señora de la Asunción, and this was the main religious center of the city. And you see it here perched up high above the rest of the city. It's quite somber facade. The interior, instead, is this wonderful Baroque over-the-top interior. This is the dome and one of the altars. And this was redecorated a number of times by the various members of the Osuna family. One of the great treasures in the collegiate church in Osuna are 5 canvases which had been brought to Osuna by the ancestors of the 9th Duke. The 3rd Duke of Osuna was a viceroy of Naples, and he was a great patron of another artist, of Ribera, another Spanish artist who had traveled to Naples as a young man, to Rome first and then Naples, and was established there. And as viceroy of Naples, the 3rd Duke commissioned a number of works which eventually made their way to Osuna. And here you see a little display that was done a few years ago of, these are 3 out of the total of 5 canvases, early works by Ribera, and these include this grand crucifixion, and then 4 slightly smaller paintings Two of them are individual saints. On the left is the penitent St. Peter, on the right, St. Sebastian, and two more showing the martyrdom of St. Bartholomew and the vision of St. Jerome on the right. And so these were all painted in Naples in the early 17th century and then found their way to Osuna, to the collegiate church, where they can be seen today. But under the church is this wonderful crypt. And this is a 16th century construction you see here, decorated in this very strange and whimsical way with this gold coffering and paintings and various sculptures, including a really marvelous relief of Saint Jerome. And this is the crypt under the cathedral where the Dukes of Osuna are buried. So if you go down in the crypt, you find a series of different rooms with the coffins of all the members of the Osuna family. And here are some of the earliest dukes and relatives. Of course, the viceroys of Naples and the fourth duke was also viceroy of Sicily. They're all buried here. And this is, again, one of the crypts where you see tombs from different levels. And if you look at the top right, the white marble slab, next to it, there is a photograph of the portrait of the Duchess. And this, of course, is the tomb of the 9th Duchess and also Countess Duchess of Benevente, who was buried here after she died in Madrid. I went to Osuna many years ago in the footsteps of the 9th Duke, looking for his tomb. And of course, while most dukes, his son, his ancestors, his wife, they're all buried here in Osuna, the only one who isn't is actually the 9th Duke. And that is because the 9th Duke asked to be buried when he died in 1807 in this church, which is the Convent of the Victoria, the Convent of Victory, in Madrid. This was in the center of Madrid, very close to the Puerta del Sol, the main central square of Madrid. And unfortunately, this convent was destroyed in 1836, 1837, at a time when many religious institutions in Spain were being suppressed and demolished, with very anti-clerical and anti-aristocratic sentiments. So unfortunately, with the destruction of the convent, the tomb of the 9th Duke and his monument was altogether destroyed. We have no image of what it looked like, and all we know is that he asked to be buried there in the center of Madrid rather than in Osuna, and with the destruction of the church, the tomb is gone. So what remains of the Duke is not his physical remains, his physical tomb, as it does for the Duchess, but he remains in our memory mostly through his patronage of Goya. And so even though the trip to Osuna for me was a very interesting stepping back in history and thinking about the several generations of Osuna dukes and their patronage of the arts, I had to come back to the Frick to see the Duke himself in this wonderful Goya portrait. So again, next time you travel to the south of Spain, do visit Osuna. The Riberas there are absolutely incredible, and the mausoleum of the Dukes and the Collegiate Church and many of the other buildings and monuments in the city are definitely worth a trip. Thank you for joining me this evening, and I look forward to seeing you all again next week with another episode of Travels with a Curator.